We're going to go live. All right, and welcome to the Permaculture Podcast live stream on starting your permaculture library. Today I want to walk you through the 4 books that I think are the first essentials to include in your permaculture library, and then also add to that 2 additional books that I think are super useful once you've started down this journey. Um, these are the books that, after years of reading through all this material and talking with other permaculture instructors, that we've kind of agreed are great core books for you to begin with, both as a permaculture student or somebody interested in these ideas. And so I've kind of collapsed it down to a comprehensive introductory permaculture education. If you were just going to be, planting a garden in your backyard and that's all the further that you wanted to take your permaculture practices, then some of these books would be the ones that I would recommend if you could have only one book and in order to implement permaculture where you live. When it comes to expanding out on these ideas, there are some other pieces that I would suggest as you move your practices forward. But this is, as I say, for anyone who is interested in a comprehensive look at permaculture. If you're a fan, if you follow the show over on Patreon at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast, of course, you've heard about some of these books, particularly the first one that I'm going to recommend, which is The One Straw Revolution by Masanobu Fukuoka. This book is always my first recommend because I like the way that these short articles give you a deep understanding and appreciation for the ideas that went into the natural farming that Masanobu Fukuoka was implementing in Japan. It's also a great book because this book and these ideas were brought to the West by Larry Korn, who was someone, just a great mentor within the community, was really big about communicating these ideas and sharing the difference between natural farming and permaculture and the way that these approaches are compatible but distinct. And even though this is not at its core a permaculture book, I find that the One Straw Revolution and the ideas that are presented form a great philosophical underpinning for anyone who is interested in understanding how to deepen our connection to the natural world and break down some of those barriers between human beings and the other than human, and also to look for the ways that we can create synergistic relationships between cultivation and agriculture and other systems that we might find. Because of those systems approaches within permaculture and how much systems thinking is a part of these processes that we engage in when it comes to design, I think that the best book to follow up One Straw Revolution with is Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. My recollection is that Donella was one of the folks who was involved in early cybernetics work at MIT and the interaction between human beings and technology, and how we can use all of the resources that are available to us. And her book, Thinking in Systems, a primer, is a great introduction to systems thinking and systems approaches. It's a short book, the kind of thing that you could pick up on Friday and have read by Monday, but goes really deeply into systems theory and what it looks like when we want to start thinking this way. And so gives a lot of great simple examples on understanding things like inflows and outflows, using a bathtub and the water coming in and the drain coming out as a representation. And so throughout Thinking in Systems, Ms. Meadows gives us really approachable ideas compared to something like the work of systems ecology and some of the other early influences on permaculture, this is a much more approachable book for those of us who are interested in getting a better idea of what systems thinking is all about. From there is the first book that I recommend that really starts to dive into permaculture and is a practical approach, and that is Rosemary Morrow's Earth User's Guide to Permaculture. Last I checked, it's in the second edition, which you can see the cover for here. I like this book instead of some others, which, when I was first looking at what book to put here as a practical approach to permaculture, this was tied with Toby Hemingway's Gaia's Garden. But what I really like about Mel Morrow's Earth User's Guide to Permaculture is not only does she dig into the practical and what it means to create a permaculture garden, but also gets into a lot of the questions that are required to get us to think about permaculture and how we're going to implement this in the landscape. And so it's just a nice mix of the practical and the philosophical, and answers a lot of the questions about, like, what do I want to put into a system? How do I want to use those things? And also there's, if you're a permaculture teacher, there's a companion book to this that is Teacher's Notes, that I also highly recommend. They go really well together. And for my permaculture design courses, I use Earth User's Guide to Permaculture as my primary textbook. And it's fantastic, easy to understand, and just full of details. Plus the line drawings they're kind of cute and approachable, making it a book that I think is also appropriate for families to sit down if they want to, have a family book club and talk about permaculture with people of all ages. I think it's approachable both for adults and children. The other book that I use as a textbook within my permaculture design courses, and that I think is like the ideal way to dive deep into the principles of permaculture, is Permaculture: Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability by David Holmgren. David was there originating these ideas in the 1970s, worked with Bill to develop what became Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2. But then once these ideas were together, David kind of went back to Meliodora in Australia, his farm, and put all those ideas that they were working on into practice, and spent, decades proving out these ideas before finally writing Permaculture: Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which the first edition was released, I think about 20 years ago, and really began to change the ideas of what it means to practice permaculture in the world. And so, this is the one that I really recommend if you want to dig in deep into the principles which have become, the most common. David's 12, which you can find at Permaculture Principles. I think there is a .com now, but you can also find it at .co.au. But this is David's personal deep exploration of permaculture, and addresses how permaculture is different from ideas like natural farming or organic agriculture, and is a really deep dive. This is one that it took me a while to read through and really find it a connection to it. Took me a while, if you will, to grok and be able to make use of. But as I read it a couple of times and really dove into my permaculture work 2 or 3 years in, like, it really connected and just made a lot of sense on where David was coming from, and why not only does this work matter, but what it looks like in the world, and why it's more than just growing food, though growing food is incredibly important to our work and practices as permaculture practitioners, because without food, we can't build the rest of the culture and civilization that we need. But yeah, for anyone, this is, if I personally could have one book on permaculture in my library, this would be it. But you do, I feel, need to have a grounding in permaculture before this is the one that you spend a lot of your time with. Whether that's by reading the other books or by taking a permaculture design class and then using this as your route. Now, those are the 4 books that I think are the essential for any permaculture library, and the order that I would recommend reading them in. they're all fantastic. They're great. But there are some other books that to me really add to this education and are kind of the honorable mentions of a starting permaculture library. If you are going to be practicing permaculture in just your backyard, I've got a great book for that. If you want to deepen your understanding of permaculture philosophy, that's the next book that or permaculture adjacent philosophy, that's the next book that I'm going to recommend, which is Daniel Quinn's Ishmael. This book, which I read really for the first time during my permaculture design course a little over 10 years ago, was the book that really got me thinking about what it means to embrace the ethics of permaculture and live deeply into them, and to leave more for future generations than what it is that I would take. That idea of, caring for people as the second ethic of permaculture, but also the creation and return of a surplus, and how that it means more than just, um, the immediate now, but what it means for us to build soil, what it means for us to think about future generations. I think that Daniel Quinn just pulls together so beautifully in Ishmael. And even though it's a novel and an allegorical approach to these ideas, it is something that is really accessible. And though I want to reread it from the beginning to make sure everything is appropriate, it would be a good book, I think, for parents to read to older children and include them in the conversation about what we can do to care for Earth and people, and yeah, to do more than just to be extractive. And I really appreciate Ishmael, and as I say, the impact that it had for me on considering my use of resources. There are a lot of times that we can, buy things twice in order to find something that's right. And, what can we do to ensure that we are making the best choices in the world that we currently live in? And Ishmael, yeah, is just beautiful for that, and getting us thinking that way. The final book that I recommend for anyone on their permaculture journey to start their library is the number one selling permaculture book of all time, Gaia's Garden. It is a book that personally it took me a long time to connect with, and it was kind of something that I circled back around to after watching videos of Toby on YouTube and getting a better understanding of his worldview and what it is that he was doing in the world and bringing these ideas to us. And I really, if out of everyone I've gotten to know in the permaculture community, regretfully Toby left us a number of years ago at this point. But he's the person who, at the moment, I really continue to miss the most. His book is filled with practical wisdom and application of these ideas in the backyard. And he shows us, copious examples of what it looks like to practice permaculture, which I think makes it really just super accessible. And a lot of the pictures that you'll find, including, the large picture on the front cover, which you can see here, are examples that come from Will Hooker's garden. Professor Hooker taught permaculture at the graduate level. And I'll have to see if they're still available, but his lectures taught at, I think it was the University of North Carolina, are still or were available on YouTube, so you could see what Will was teaching. But he and Toby apparently had a very, good working relationship, and Toby was able to include a lot of Will's gardens in Gaia's Garden. But yeah, Toby's book is just a fantastic look at permaculture in practice when it comes to growing food, and writes in such a way that it's just available immediately to the reader, and is one that even if you're not in a place to grow a garden, it's still worth reading and having in your library. And one that, though I wouldn't say it's I always think of coffee table books as these big books, but I think that if you want to introduce somebody to permaculture, just leave a copy of Gaia's Garden out there on your coffee table and let people pick it up and thumb through it and take a look at it. And thinking about that introduction to permaculture for people, if you wanted to have some books that you want folks to look through and get an idea of what this permaculture thing is all about, um, from this list, these 6 books, these are the books that I recommend, and they are in that order of The One Straw Revolution, followed by Thinking in Systems, followed by Earth User's Guide to Permaculture, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, Ishmael, and then Gaia's Garden. As a permaculture practitioner, those are the 6 books and the order that I would recommend that you read them. If you are looking for something to introduce someone to permaculture, I would probably give them Earth User's Guide to Permaculture and Gaia's Garden. If you wanted to start a book club and do a lot of reading around these ideas, then probably One Straw Revolution followed by Ishmael. Um, if I were to buy a case of books to introduce someone to permaculture, um, One Straw Revolution, Earth User's Guide, and then Ishmael. Like, I'd buy those by the case and just give them out at every holiday. Check with my friends. Hey, have you read this? You should. They're just super accessible, easy for people to find, and just my favorite books around this. If you want to dig in deeper to permaculture, then Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, I still keep referring back to. There is a second edition available, or not a second edition, but a revised edition that came out a few years ago that is available from the permaculture store, which I can get links to, particularly Patreon folks. I'll drop that into a message for you here. But those are kind of the books that I would start with. If you're watching this and there are certain books that you think are super important for you and what it is that you're doing, then certainly drop something in the comments and let me know. I'm always interested in understanding how people can interact with this information and relate to it better. There's just so much out there now. Like, Michael Judd's books are really good, and practical approaches to implementing these ideas in the garden. I really like a lot of what he's doing when it comes to, create a super small guild, pick a tree if you've got room in your backyard, plant that tree, create your garden around that, because you can have this just little like micro permaculture garden that still allows you to learn all these principles. The folks at the permaculture, or the Philadelphia Orchard Project in Philadelphia, for them, an orchard can be a single tree. So there are lots of different ways that we can approach what it means to implement and practice permaculture in the world. But as I say, for me, these are, the 4 books in a core library, and then we have a few other books to add to it to round it out. I still think that Bill Mollison's Permaculture, A Designer's Manual is a fantastic book to get if you can find it inexpensively. Used copies can be hundreds of dollars at this point because there have only been a few print runs. But at this time, I think that Mollison's Designer's Manual is more of a historic text for us to use as reference to understand what Bill was thinking about in the world. But it is not as complete as we might find by pulling together our own specific library around where our interests are. And it's been part of the conversation about what does a permaculture education look like these days, because there are different ways to approach this. And that, in my conversations with people like David Holmgren, or, my own permaculture teachers, Ben Weiss, Dylan Neighbor Cruz, that we kind of sat down and talked about what does permaculture education look like now, and there are certainly core ideas that we need to include. And that really builds around our ideas of the 72-hour permaculture curriculum is the core standard for everybody. But there's a lot that we can add to that. The core permaculture education didn't really include a lot about mycology, but mushrooms are emerging to become more and more important. Chapter 14 of the Designer's Manual was all about the non-land-based practices when it comes to what do alternative economics look like? What can we do to engage with systems in the world that are not in the landscape, because not everybody's going to garden on a large scale or in a way that allows them to reproduce or replicate a lot of their food. So, what can we do then in that context to still engage in permaculture at a deep level? And there are folks like, we could read the work of David Graeber, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, to get a better understanding of the way that economics relate to our like human relationships and the way that money differs when explored by anthropologists compared to economists, which is a really important conversation to understand how money relates to the world, or to understand that barter largely emerges in communities that already have an understanding of economic value, that what we might think of as common sense is barter is a non-economic system, or a non-monetary economic system, I should say. But when you dig into these ideas from the anthropological perspective and this deep work of folks like David Graeber, that barter doesn't exist without an understanding of monetary value, which I think is like super fascinating. Um, there's donut economics and the way that we can change things. You've got folks like Charles Eisenstein, who writes about sacred economics, and though we can agree or disagree with someone, the way that having an understanding of those ideas deepens our ability as permaculture practitioners to do this work in the world. Why things like time banking are important, because the way that it values, human time as opposed to what we might think of as a return in the marketplace. So yeah, I'm planning to do more live streams like this in the future to address these various aspects of books that are worth reading, things that are of value to add to your permaculture library, different places you can go to deepen your own understanding of ideas like foraging. What are some of the books I'd recommend on foraging? What are some of the books that I would recommend on different political systems? And perhaps dig a bit into my personal politics when we have those conversations. But as before I draw this to a close, for those of you who are here as part of the live stream, do you have any questions for me, or any suggestions for what you would like to see in a future conversation about what knowledge to include in what it is that you're doing or might be interested in? And Bless, with your comment about knowing what to dig into, it's been a large part of my journey through permaculture, is that there are so many amazing resources available out there. I have like 600 episodes of the show, but just to sit and listen to something like that, or to go to a YouTube channel and just start watching, there's just so much available to us that wasn't there even a few years ago. And as people continue to talk about these ideas and write about them and build out what it is that it means to practice permaculture, it continues to become more and more diverse, and becomes a bit more difficult to engage in, or to know what information is good and what isn't. Um, I tend to rely on books or folks who I know who've been doing this work for, years and years and years, rather than just to hop onto a YouTube channel and see what's out there. Um, there are lots of beautiful gardens, but when we look at them, it's how ecologically functional are they? How much do they dig into the ideas of permaculture and what it is that we're doing? It's why I released those posts about practicing permaculture in 4 questions, because there's a lot of things that get muddied into these practices that are beyond what really digs into what it is that we're doing. Because permaculture is a straightforward practice. It is fairly straightforward that as long as what we're doing satisfies the ethics, and being kind to ourselves because we're in a period of transition, that's what the depth of this is for me. and where I think that we need to be considering where our practices are and where they're going. Um, but yeah, so we'll continue doing these and digging in. And I don't have a date yet. I think I will do another one of these weekly ones um, next Wednesday, the 26th. I'll do one again during the day, like we have here. Um, I also may go ahead and do another live stream on Saturday. Now that we're kind of moving into the slow after times, my wife will be gone for a bit. So, yeah, let's look for another live stream on the 22nd. I don't have a topic yet, but I'll figure something out before then. And then we'll do another one on the 26th. So, until then, since there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and bring this to a close. And thank you, everyone, for joining me for this conversation about starting your own permaculture library.